Hi and welcome to Whisky Shared. In this video I'll be reviewing the Teeling Trinity pack. I'm Toby and you're watching Whisky Shared. Today we're off to the Teeling Whisky Distillery in Dublin, Ireland. Teeling's a fairly new distillery. I visited them last year when I went to Dublin, and I picked up this sample pack after I did one of their tours. They're a fairly new distillery, only been making whisky for a few years now, and they've only recently, in the last year, produced their first whisky that's fully aged from the spirit coming out of their distillery in Dublin. A little bit about Teeling. The Teeling name is quite famous within Irish whisky circles. John Teeling founded the Cooley distillery, and when he sold that a good number of years ago, he kept some of the barrels of the stock that they'd made under the Cooley distillery. And when his sons decided to revive that name under an Irish whisky brand in Dublin, they started, as they meant to go on, by reviving some of the whisky within those barrels that their father had kept back, and introduced that as stock for their fledgling business. Obviously people were aware of the heritage that their father had in the distilling business, and they produced whisky in a similar style, and that's how they mean to go on. The three whiskies we're going to try today are the single grain, the small batch and the single malt. I'll tell you a little bit about them as I go through and taste them, but should we find out what they're like? On to the whisky. Right, so I poured them in the order of small batch, single grain and single malt. I'll put labels down there to make it easier for you to follow along. The small batch is one that you find in UK supermarkets. The other two aren't easily available like that, but you can find them in most specialist retailers, along with some of their more aged stock, which obviously originates from the old Cooley distillery. The small batch is an interesting one because it's a mix of corn and malted barley. So it's column stilled grain made from corn and malted barley, a ratio of about 3:1, and then it's finished in Central American rum casks for about 12 months. This whisky retails at about £37, something like that, and it's 46%, as are all of these three whiskies, and it's non-chill filtered. I don't know if it's uncoloured, because it doesn't say, and neither do the other two. So let's try this on the nose. Right, so it's quite sweet, but I also get a little bit of alcohol vapour. Yeah, lots of vanilla. Yeah, the brown sugars are coming through from the rum, but it's not that strong. Yeah, I'd say there's a hint of nail polish remover, a little bit of like acetone, but it's mostly sweet, a little bit creamy on the nose. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I expected maybe a little bit more off the nose, but yeah, it's quite simple at this stage. Let's move on to the nose of the single grain. So the single grain is not what you'd expect, and isn't just a single grain. There's obviously certain requirements within Irish whiskey production, but this is about 95% corn, but it's 5% malted barley, so it isn't technically a single grain in that respect, but it obviously classifies as a single grain, assuming it has to be over a certain amount within Irish whiskey. But yeah, it's corn and malted barley, but it's then finished in ex-Cabernet Sauvignon casks from California. So it obviously has a red wine maturation. Let's try this on the nose. It's interesting because I definitely get the malt on the nose with this. Being single grain, or very high grain content coming from column still, there is quite a lot of alcohol vapour. It definitely comes across more chemical. That red wine influence on the nose isn't rounding things off. It's almost like a sourness on the nose. Interestingly, I've tried all three of these before when I was at the distillery. They were part of the tasting at the end of the tour, and there were 4 whiskies in total. These were 3. These 3 were included. But the other one that isn't here is the single pot still. That one for me was actually the best one, and I can't actually remember which I preferred in which order of these. So you know, this may bring back memories, but on the nose isn't really triggering much so far. So not really getting much from the single grain. Lots of chemical notes and only a little bit of sweetness, but mostly malted barley on the nose, which is really strange as it's only 5% makeup. So let's move on to the single malt. The single malt, as you'd expect, is 100% malted barley, and that is then matured in 5 different wine casks, and they are sherry, port, Madeira, white Burgundy and Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's a right old mix, non-chill filtered as per the others. So let's try this one on the nose. Right, that instantly gives me a completely different nose. It smells a little bit malty. It's triple distilled, so it's almost like reminiscent of Bushmills single malt. It's quite sweet, not too strong on the cereal note, but there is one. Yeah, and I'm definitely picking up some sort of sherry on the nose. Maybe it's the Madeira or the port. Don't know. That's quite nice on the nose. Okay, so in terms of nose, I'd say single malt, then small batch, then single grain, but it might change completely on the palate. So let's try the small batch on the palate. That's really quite nice. The whiskey has a nice sort of malty character to start with, and then you get those sweet brown sugars from the rum. Then you get a little bit of spice, almost like a like a chili pepper spice on the centre of the tongue. That probably comes from the grain whiskey. As it then evaporates, there's a little bit of sort of alcohol vapour, nail polish remover. It has got that sort of chemical element to it, but it's got a good amount of ABV being 46%, it means that you can play with that. You can bring that down by a few percentage points, adding a little bit of water to get that where you want. But that's actually quite pleasant. It has that sort of Irish whiskey character as well. There is a bit of creaminess. There is a bit of vanilla in there as well. And on the finish, it's not too dry. It's a little bit dry, but yeah, it's quite nice. Right, so let's move on to the single grain. Single grain retails around the £42–43 mark, I think. So let's try this on the palate. Okay, that's it's much more pleasant on the palate than I was expecting from the nose. It's very sweet. You can definitely tell there's a wine influence there. It's quite a simple liquid, but the alcohol vapor doesn't dominate. I was expecting it to be a lot more chemical on the palate. I think what the heavy corn content gives is a simplicity, but there is a sweetness, there is a vanilla, but there's also a slight bitterness from the wine, and it definitely reminds me of other wine finished Irish whiskies, very similar in nature to something like Jameson Crested, but doesn't have the creaminess that that has with you know, a higher malt content. But it's yeah, it's really quite pleasant. Will I pay £43 for it? Probably not. Although I have paid similar money for a single grain Japanese whiskey. They are quite simple. Obviously, it's quite a young whiskey, but it's yeah, it's not really doing much for me. Right, so let's move on to the single malt. The single malt retails for about £50. So obviously price is going to be a factor if you're going to choose a bottle of this. So let's see what the palate delivers. Okay, so the single malt is a million miles away from the other two. It has quite a strong, as you expect, cereal sort of malt character. It's a little bit bitter, a little bit tannic. Obviously, I'm guessing it gets that from obviously the 5 wine casks it's been in. But it's a little bit more viscous. It clings to the palate more. There's a little bit of peppery spice. It's not overly sweet, and it's quite a robust liquid. It just feels grown up. I'd say it probably feels older than it probably is. You could probably get away with that being 7 or 8 years old, but yeah, for a young liquid, it's really quite grown up. Would I pay £50 for it? Yeah, probably would, because obviously it's a craft whiskey. It's made in smaller amounts than a lot of the big distilleries. It's going to command, you know, that higher price. But yeah, for me, on the nose and the palate, it's the best of the 3. I'd probably say that the small batch comes second and the single grain comes third. So It's interesting, and obviously if you're not going to the distillery, you can still buy the Trinity pack and you can try them at home, so you don't have to you know, spend £35 to £50 on a bottle that you might not enjoy. But for me, that single malt is the best of the bunch. From memory though, it's not as good as single pot still, and that's not much more expensive. That's about the £50–55 mark. So if you get a chance to try that, also give that a go. But I'm going to stick with the single malt, and I'll see you next time. Slauncher. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, why not give it a like or a comment, and please consider subscribing for more videos like this.